Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us, and welcome to this breakout session in which we will be introducing you to BSI ISO 30415 2021 Human Resource Management, Diversity and Inclusion. My name's Helena Barrell and I'm a Standards Development Manager at BSI. Before I introduce the speakers, I would just like to encourage you all to take part in the session today by submitting your questions at any point via the Q&A function. So we have an amazing panel of experts joining us live today who are all members of BSI's Committee on Human Resource Management. We have Kevin Bosher, who is HS2 Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Lead at MACE, and Heather Bond, who is Senior Advisor in Standards at the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development and Chair of the BSI Committee. They both represent the UK on the ISO Technical Committee 260 and helped to write ISO 30415. We're also joined by John Mulholland, who is Managing Director of the Training and Consultancy business, PDQ Solutions, and an associate of the Centre for Assessment, where he's recently been involved in the rollout of ISO 30415. We'll also be watching some pre-recorded videos, which have kindly been prepared for us by three of the other international members of ISO Technical Committee 260, who helped to write ISO 30415. So Kevin's now going to get us started by giving us some background to the standard. So over to you, Kevin.
Thanks very much, Helena, and welcome everybody, and thanks for the opportunity of coming and speaking to you at your conference. As you've heard, my name's Kevin Bosher. I am a practitioner in equality, diversity and inclusion, and have been operating in this arena for many years, more than I can actually want to disclose because it's that long. But it was a real honor to be involved in the development of ISO 30415. And just want to tell you a little bit about why the standard was developed, and then hand over to my colleague Heather. So next slide, please. So what was the driver for the standard? In reality, a number of factors, but it was understood that organizations globally were asking questions such as, what do we need to do about diversity and inclusion? And where do we get really informed information? Who can we ask? Because organizations were under the belief that they were working with workplace cultures driven by, for example, cultural beliefs, and where sometimes those cultural beliefs caused conflict or brought people into discord because of their different beliefs, and issues about traditions, the way things were done. Sometimes when new people joined, they didn't necessarily understand what those traditions were and where they'd been formed from. And religious beliefs, in the same way that cultural beliefs could cause confusion and conflict, then religious beliefs could do too. And of course, we know that in many workplaces, in fact, just about every workplace, people who are different are often stigmatized, and organizations knew that, and they wanted to understand how to address it. And of course, not only about workplaces, because organizations traditionally also work with customers. That's how they exist. And they often have clients and other key stakeholders. Many of those would be from different backgrounds, different origins, have different cultural beliefs, etc. So organizations were asking these questions. Next slide, please. So what about the reason for an ISO standard then? Why? Well, actually, you probably already know there were and are a plethora of diversity and inclusion standards in a sort of an unregulated market. Some of these standards have great reputations, some of them not so. And here's some examples you'll see listed there of different standards that exist, and many of them are commercial arrangements. And in some countries, such as the UK and France, there already were national standards, because we had in the UK introduced BS 76005 as a national standard, but at the same time as there were talks about developing an ISO standard. It's understood, I think, within those conversations that diversity and inclusion is now a global issue, and some of these standards were very much national in approach or local in approach. because many organizations operate globally. They may have footprints here in the UK, but they may have footprints in other countries. And it is understood that organizations, as I've already said, didn't really understand some of the issues that existed. So, for example, the reaction to the Black Lives Matter approach after the death of Floyd, some organizations were hamstrung by the reaction to the organization Black Lives Matter, where others were thinking, well, actually, it's about the concept. So there was a need for something that actually helped them. Risks and opportunities were not always being identified, because there are great opportunities to go along with diversity and inclusion. We know that. And terminology is also often inconsistent. And as I've already said, organizations, didn't really know what actions to take. And we know that ISO standards have a great deal of credibility. Next slide, please. So standards overall, I'm teaching to suck eggs here, I know, but basically standards provide a recognition and the importance of a particular theme or topic, because if it has a standard applied, then it must be important. Standards provide practical advice and guidance, and they need to be written for all levels of experience and suitable for all types of organizations, whatever their size, context, location, sector, or maturity. And the next slide, please. So in addition to this this approach around why standards would be important, it was really key for us to understand, with the development of the ISO 30415, the alignment with the United Nations Sustainability Goals, in particular in terms of gender equality, fair work, etc. And these had been internationally agreed, and they were therefore something that the standard needed to take account of. And the next slide, please. Of course, this standard exists within a suite of human resource management standards, as you see there in the red text. Its relationship alongside these other standards, these other parts of the suite. And of course, that meant there needed to be consistency and interrelationship between the development of these standards and 30415. And just to talk about BS 76005, diversity and inclusion, just to say that it had been developed in the UK. I'd been involved as a header in developing that standard. So we took what we knew of that standard with us to the committee to develop ISO 30415, and it actually gave us a great deal of base information to start with. And the next slide, please. This is really just to tell you about the journey. I'm not going to go through slavishly each ladder of these dates, etc. But basically, BS 76005 was published, and virtually at the same time, talks were already underway in terms of developing ISO 30415. And from the very beginning, a meeting in London in 2017, through these plenary sessions and agreements and drafts. And the next slide, please. Resulting finally in a final draft in November 2020, after a significant number of meetings, which became virtual because of COVID. The draft was accepted and adopted, and in the UK in February 2021. It replaces BS 76005, but both are in use until May 2023 to take account of those people who had purchased the UK standard. So that just gives you a flavour of the journey that was undertaken to get us to where we are. And the next slide, please. So this is Lorie Carabellante, who was the convener of the committee that worked on 30415, a renowned expert in diversity and inclusion from the US, based in the US, and this is her message to us. Well, I'm not sure we've got any sound. So maybe the best thing would be to move right into Heather's presentation, I think.
Sorry about that, everybody. Okay, so I'll now introduce Heather, who is going to talk about who's going to introduce the standard and cover what's in it, its scope and its structure. Over to you, Heather.
Thank you, Helena. And good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining. I think we can move on to the first slide from me, and thank you. So Kevin referred to the SDGs, and to be fair, when we commenced the journey of the international standard, they weren't really on our agenda. They were enacted in 2016, and our initial discussions sort of predated that. But by the time of our last in-person plenary meeting in September 2019, there was the SDG Summit, which announced the Decade of Action. And this is when we identified the need to call them out in our introduction. So they're specifically called out in the introduction to the standard, and in particular, SDG 5, which is gender equality, SDG 8 on decent work and economic growth, SDG 9, industry, innovation and infrastructure, SDG 10, reduced inequalities. Of these, I would say the one that is the most important is SDG 8 and decent work. It's a key focus in the standard and can be identified in the UK, referred to as good work, and possibly in Scotland and Australia as fair work. But it's all basically concerning with achieving decent work and economic growth, promoting sustained and inclusive and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment for all. If I was to touch on the SDG 10, that is to ensure that no one is left behind within and among countries, so reducing inequalities across the world. And I guess this talks to the levelling up agenda. So what's particularly important about the SDGs and our standard is that for responsible businesses or organisations that want to demonstrate their credentials as a responsible business, it's linked to the ESG agenda. So we know that in the corporate world, investor organisations, those that focus on ESG, they're very keen on identifying the people dimension of the workplace. So the guidance in our document is actually geared towards this too, as is another standard in our suite on human capital reporting. So I think we can move to the next slide, Helena, thank you. So this is the context of our standard. Figure 1 was also purposely part of the introduction, so it's very visible to everybody who accesses the ISO website. And for me, it serves a number of purposes. It shows or it illustrates actually what's in the standard and how it is structured. It also captures the world of work, which may seem complex as a figure, but the world of work is a complex thing, and it has been disrupted significantly in the last 2-year period when we were, completing and finalising the standard. It also sort of depicts a jigsaw puzzle, which can be seen as a big picture made up of small pieces of different sizes, shape and hue, which is pretty much on the money when it comes to D&I because everybody is different. And you can see how they intersect together, as do diversity dimensions in people, they intersect. It also reflects the international dimension of the standard and the collaboration of experts of participating member countries who worked across various time zones. And as Kevin referred to during the final stages of the development of the standard, when we were disposing of thousands of comments actually in the course of that time, we met 3 times a week during the first lockdown, which was quite a significant effort, I have to say, across different time zones. And you can see from this figure that we haven't confined ourselves to the domain of human resource management, even though it is within the suite of ISO 260 suite. Because HR is not necessarily enacted in the same way in different parts of the world, it's more or less mature, and perhaps some organizations don't have an HR, designated HR function. We thought we would spread ourselves a bit more broadly, so we've not confined ourselves to the HR domain, but it is our key focus. We see HR not in isolation, but as the steward or the guardian and advocate of good D&I practice across all organisation functions, including products and services, supply chain, partner relationships, and other stakeholder relationships. Next slide, please, Helena. I'm sure most of you are aware of the language of standards. So this is a guidance document, as is our other key document, human capital reporting. So we have agreed vocabulary across this standard, and I lead the vocabulary standard for TC 260. So it is my task to make sure that we are all lined up. We recognise that all organisations are different, as do every other standard. And we recognise the different growth states and the size and the context of organisations. So the intention is that it should be able to be scaled to fit all circumstances and implemented to reflect what is material or most significant to that particular organisation's context. And to recognise that we all have similar but different challenges, risks and opportunities. Also, like all other standards, it doesn't reflect any reference to law or regulations in different parts of the world. And this is critical for D&I because, of course, in Europe, there are different variations on diversity and inclusion law, discrimination law, and in the States, it's across different states of the United States of America where it's different. So our intention is capacity building and to provide recommended guidance that influences good D&I practice in wider work and workplace contexts. We've identified key terms, as I mentioned, intersectionality, equity, equality, diversity, inclusion, materiality. So I think we've been we've thought long and hard about the terms that we've used. Next slide, please, Helena. So the key elements of the standard, it follows the normal format of a guidance standard. So clause 1 to 3 are as usual. Clause 4, which I'll come back to later, is where we've identified our prerequisites that are fundamental to building good D&I foundations. And then we have also in clause 5 focused on accountabilities and responsibilities, specifically organisational governance, organisational leadership, people who have roles where they have designated responsibility for diversity and inclusion. But ultimately, we've also identified that every individual is also ultimately responsible. The D&I framework is a key clause. It's owned by the organisation, and within it, we're encouraging organisations to identify their own D&I objectives, principles, to identify who's accountable and who's responsible, to identify the opportunities and risks, and the adverse impacts or outcomes that they might anticipate. Clause 7 is inclusive culture, which is very critical, the importance of developing and maintaining an inclusive culture in an organisation. Clause 8 is human resource life cycle from start to finish, so basically attracting, developing and employing people. Clause 9 is products and services. Clause 10, procurement and the supply chain. And clause 11, relationships with external stakeholders. Within each of the clauses, there's a format, a sub-format. We introduce what it is in a brief introductory paragraph, but then we focus on actions that organisations should take, measures that they might want to consider implementing without defining specifically what the measure is, impacts, what are the potential actual impacts and on who, and outcomes, what could the organisation hope to achieve or expect to achieve? So basically, when it comes to organising D&I, it's the strategic choices really matter. Employers are the primary actors in decent work, and how they enact their policies, processes and practices and behave is very key to developing an inclusive culture and a good grounding for enabling everybody to participate in the world of work. Next slide, please, Helena. So these are our prerequisites. We've identified, rather than do principles ourselves that we would have expected everybody to adopt, we've decided that the fundamental prerequisites are recognising diversity, governing effectively, acting accountably, working inclusively and communicating inclusively, and advocating and championing D&I. So basically recognising that everybody is different and valuing everybody's differences, and exemplifying and promoting leadership commitment right from the top, very key, and acting accountably, ethically and socially responsible behaviour, and promoting productive employment and decent work. So finally, advocating and championing D&I, actively influencing and promoting inclusive organisational practices and stakeholder relationships. And during the course of the final stages of development of the standard, there were a number of challenges in the supply chain, where basically, I think there's been a session this morning on modern slavery, so I think it was very relevant. Next slide, please, Helena. Human resource life cycle is the key focus of the standard. I think we can move on to the next slide, Helena, actually, at the same time. And you can see that we've looked at everything within that human resource life cycle, starting with workforce planning, which is a key data collection point, all the way through to cessation of employment. And there are standards within our suite which deal with these topics specifically. So we've only got a brief paragraph to introduce the topic within each of the subclause sections. And then you can see in the right-hand side of the picture that this whole context. So we don't see it as just an HR issue. It's how do we influence the supply chain to do better in terms of diversity and inclusion. Next slide, please, Helena. So this is a picture of our standard without the jigsaw puzzle parts, to just demonstrate that we are advocating a continual improvement approach. So not quite a management system standard, but on the same theme. And it's pretty much what we did with the development of the standard. We planned it, we drafted it, we redid it numerous times, and we hope that organisations will find it useful. And I'm not quite sure whether the next slide will play with sound, but we do have some comments from our colleague in Australia, Christina Schwenke, who was, she is an expert in disability and ageing. Over to Christina. Hopefully we can hear her.
Hello from Australia. I'm Christina Schwenke, and I was a registered technical expert on the ISO working group that developed ISO 30415, the Human Resource Management Standard on Diversity and Inclusion. From my perspective, this is a very welcome and important standard because despite the fact that we live in a highly interconnected world, there can still be dissonance in the way concepts of diversity and inclusion are understood or acted upon. In the development of this ISO standard, we had an opportunity to reach international consensus with multiple stakeholders and produce a standard that, in the context of the HRM life cycle, is designed to help organisations set, implement and evaluate their D&I objectives and practices, and in doing so, acknowledge, motivate, sustain and better utilise the talent within their organisations and foster innovation and enhance their resilience and reputation. This new standard guides organisations every step of the way in a very practical way by providing useful terms and definitions, a D&I framework, actions, measures and outcomes that apply to the HRM life cycle, and a self-assessment checklist. It has been a privilege to have worked on the standard, and I recommend it to all organisations, regardless of size or industry sector.
Brilliant. Thank you, Heather and Christina. I'd now like to introduce our final live speaker, John Mulholland, who will be talking to us about the practical implementation of ISO 30415. Please take it away, John.
Okay. Thanks very much, Helena. Heather, thanks very much for your input there, and indeed to yourself and your colleagues for developing, in my mind, an excellent framework for improving D&I within organisations. And could I just reaffirm Kevin's point regarding the plethora of standards that I have come across over many years, be they local or nationally developed. Can I say ISO 30415 is the international standard, had input from 33 countries, and ISO is recognized worldwide as a mark of quality, as a brand of quality. So how could you begin? Right, well, first thing would be, next slide, please. First thing would be to purchase the ISO 30415, available for £260, £130 for BSI members. Okay, and I guess rather than read through this slide, what I will do is I'll talk through some key aspects that I think organizations should consider. I guess if you're going on a journey, you got to know where you want to go to, and you want to know where you're starting. So as part and parcel of this, I would think about some form of basic self-assessment to give yourself baseline data. Heather mentioned earlier on a data point being the kind of workforce planning. But again, what we want to do is to ensure that you get credit for the fine work they've done in advance. Okay, so key ingredients certainly is looking at that whole aspect of leadership commitment and looking at roles, responsibilities, accountabilities. I think communication is key with a range of stakeholders to actually see how their views can feed into your D&I strategy. Okay, what will it mean in terms of the products or services that you can develop, and look at the creativity side of things there. Again, I think part of the journey, there will be significant learning and development for people as you go. And again, hopefully foster better relations with the supply chain, with your customers and kind of the wider community. And I guess looking at the full plethora of HR policies that we look at, right through from the recruitment selection right through to the end of life cycle in terms of the redundancy, retirement, or perhaps redeployment, but look across your policies there. A word of advice, if I may. You can't change everything at once. So it's looking at what are the issues that will make the biggest difference. What are the small changes that you make that would have the biggest impact? Okay, so we would certainly be suggesting, look at that incremental approach to change, set your objectives, and again, then have a look to measure, monitor and measure how effective those are being. Okay, could I move to the next slide, please? Okay, and the next slide again. So in terms of the assessment process, at Centre for Assessment, we've made the assessment process as straightforward as we can. But again, we want a robust process because we want to ensure that people, organizations are implementing the standards properly, and that it's having an impact in terms of adding value for themselves and others associated with the organization. So in terms of going through we actually go through. There's part and parcel of the process would involve a degree of self-assessment by the organisation. And again, let me commend the self-assessment aspect of the standard that's available. Very, very comprehensive. And again, if I'm advising organisations, I would be suggesting that perhaps they use that for guidance purposes as much as anything else. But for the assessment for certification, what we look at is we look at the self-assessment of that the organisation has completed. We've tried to keep that straightforward and relatively simple. We derive evidence from two key sources, from paper evidence, okay, the likes of staff surveys and perhaps or other reports. And we also derive evidence from people. So we talk to people. We hope that the process is a human process whereby people can share some of the stories about the organization, some of their experiences of the organizations, and share some of the improvements that the organizations have made. In terms of the kind of site visit, we meet a broadly representative range of staff, and of significant importance, I guess, key output would be the report. What we tend to do with the report will be we'll identify some of your strengths in relation to the standard. More importantly, identify some areas for improvement. And we then use that on an annual basis when we conduct an annual surveillance visit. We have a 3-year assessment cycle. So what we're looking for year upon year, how have you acted upon the feedback? What changes have you made? What impact is that having for the organization? Okay, so could I move to the next slide? Yeah, so again, in terms of a process there, we talk about completing self-assessment, site visit, discussions with staff, the clear strengths and areas for improvement within the report, certification through Centre for the Assessment, and I suspect cause and good cause for celebration, and then the annual surveillance visit where we're looking to see what improvements have actually been made. Okay, in closing, could I say ISO 30415 is an excellent improvement framework for diversity and inclusion. And my last slide. Thank you. Okay, and I'll pass over.
Brilliant, thanks, John. Now we're just going to hear the last video from Finnish Henderson, who is an internationally recognised diversity thought leader. He represented the US as an expert on ISO Technical Committee 260 and was the convener of a working group responsible for the development of ISO 30415.
Hello, I'm Finnish Henderson. I'm a retired Chief Diversity Officer for a major company in the US and served for many, many years as a human resources practitioner. I spent a lot of time helping my organization develop a strategic framework for D&I and also help to provide leaders with an understanding of the business rationale and importance of diversity and inclusion. I was happy to be a part of the working group that developed this standard, the ISO standard, because I think it's important to have guidance to organizations, many of whom don't really have a good understanding of what's involved in shaping organization transformative change. And so I think the ISO standard provides a very well evidence-based approach to addressing significant gaps leading to desired outcomes for organizations of all sizes. It provides a set of objectives. It talks about outcomes, measures, and actions that can help an organization move forward in its work in this area. Diversity and inclusion change is not for the faint of heart. It requires intentional, deliberate action sustained over a period of time, and it requires committed, dedicated leadership. The standard provides foundational support in terms of things that you should look at, actions that you can consider, and measures that you can consider to calibrate your results and efforts. So the new standard, in my view, is a godsend to the diversity and inclusion community. And more importantly, it's an important tool for organizations of all sizes to use in building more sustainable change efforts and leading to successful and more inclusive organizations and organizational outcomes and performance. I'd like to thank the members of BSI and the UK who helped to shape this policy, along with many others from around the world. I think you'll be truly pleased with the results of this work, and I think it will help shape a more transformative approach to D&I within your organization, and hopefully lead to transformative outcomes. So I'm pleased to share this moment with you and wish you good luck in your efforts in the United Kingdom. Thank you and have a good day.
Great. Well, thank you so much to the panelists for those really interesting presentations. It's now time for the Q&A session. No, I'm a bit wary about time, so we'll have to be quite quick. Please do continue to keep sending your questions through the Q&A function. I can see we've had one question come through so far, which from Abdul, which says, should organisations introduce and publish metrics to measure how well they achieve this, and what would these metrics look like? For example, gender pay gap is published for driving gender equality. Heather, would you be interested in taking this question?
I would, yes, thank you. Thank you for that question. We would advocate a data-driven approach, but we realise that getting data in organisations is quite hard. So you have to first make sure that everybody feels confident that you're going to use their data and that they disclose their data in confidence, knowing it's going to be used judiciously. But yes, we would, whilst we suggest measures, we don't identify specific measures, but we do want organisations to take an evidence-based approach, and we would expect that they are reported to their accountable body. So in some corporate environments, there is an annual report, and we know from looking at annual reports and analysing them, there is a paucity of D&I data, actually a paucity. So there are people sections within annual reports, but they don't all actually have very good data. So we would support more transparent approaches. And I think David Lammy spoke at the CIPD conference a week ago, and he said you can't improve things unless you have the data. So I would say yes. Kevin's the practitioner in the D&I space. He may have a view on this too.
Well, I would actually concur with you, Heather. I think you've explained it very well. In terms of what we've tried to achieve with the standard is, as Heather has said, we've provided guidance on metrics and when you should use measures. But as is the answer for specifics on this standard, we've tried to be very general in terms of producing something that works in many contexts, and therefore not specifics in terms of UK based data around pay gaps, etc. But I think the concepts of measuring is absolutely vital, and for the reasons that Heather has said. And it'll be interesting to hear from John in terms of certification, in terms of what measures or metrics he would expect to see in that process. I think that's something that would be interesting.
Yeah. Okay, if I could come in, yeah, in terms of, I think context for the organization is really, really important, right? And it's basically saying, what are the challenges? What is the space in which the organization operates in? What are the key metrics that they've put in place, and how do they measure, and how do they report back in an appropriate manner to the appropriate stakeholders, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's perfect, John. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, John. So another question we've had through from Kate Field at BSI, which I think Kevin's already answered, but I don't know if Kevin and John would be interested in looking at it as well. Is the expectation that organisations address all areas of inclusivity, or can they or should they focus on specific areas? She says, we see a lot of focus on gender equality, but not so much on other areas of exclusion. So yeah, would any of you be interested in that question?
Well, I think Heather has provided an answer, and I think we've also answered it in the way that we've answered the question on metrics, and that is that it's about the context and the priorities for the organisation itself, whichever that is, and if that is for many areas of diversity, then absolutely the standard will drive you to include those areas. If it's for specific areas such as ethnicity, then clearly it will drive you towards that particular focus. So it does depend on the context in which you operate.
Yeah. Another question we've had through from Vicky, who says, in regards to the gender pay gap, what about those who are only years away from retirement, in terms of creating a fair system? Heather, would you like to take that question?
Yes, I mean, the form of words that we've used in the standard is basically to look at the disaggregated D&I data across the diversity dimensions to see who is adversely impacted. So we are advocating that every diversity dimension should be investigated to see if there's an adverse impact arising from an organisation's policies, processes or practices, and that we do see now that an increasing number of organisations reporting on ethnicity pay gaps and disability pay gaps should be also looked into. And I guess there is an age dimension too, and I would put myself in that category. So I'd look forward to that.
Me too.
Okay, another question I have was, in terms of getting started, are there any areas of the standard or any areas of the things that have been discussed that are more of a priority than others?
Can I take that one? Because can I suggest that often organizations do things, right? Organizations do things for very good reasons, right? I would actually go back and I would actually think about, okay, so why are you doing those things? What is your strategy? What is the rationale for the things that you do, right? And what is the rationale for the things that you want to do as regards D&I? And from that perspective, it would actually be say, okay, so what's the plan? Where do we want to get to? What are the actions that we're going to take, and how are we going to measure that? Okay, and what impact will that have? So I'm not sure if that helps, Helena.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. Yeah, so
I think to build on John's input, I thought he succinctly referenced the self-assessment, and I think that the getting started and understanding your starting position is absolutely an important thing to do. And that self-assessment will help you do that, I think. So perhaps the priority ought to be about identifying where you are now.
Yeah.
Good point. Great point.
Okay, so we're bang on 12:15 now. Does anyone have any final words that they'd like to say about the new standard? Or
I've got a final quote that I heard yesterday, and it sort of resonated with me. It said that we're all in a storm, but we're not all in the same boat. And I think that's what we should remember, that everybody's boat trip is slightly different. And at the moment, we've got choppy waters to navigate. So we need to look at everybody as an individual and think about the outcomes and impacts for everybody in terms of organisational practices.
brilliant.
Okay.
All right. Well, I'd like to say a massive thank you to all the panelists for your presentations today. I think they provide a really comprehensive introduction to the standard, and I'd also like to thank the international speakers for recording their videos, and I'm sorry that it didn't work out with playing Lorelei's. And also I'd like to thank everyone in the audience for joining us. Thanks everyone, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.